This is LXBN TV, and I'm Colin O'Keefe. Maryland is the first state to pass legislation forbidding employers from asking employees and job applicants for their Facebook passwords. To discuss it, we bring in Philip Gordon, chair of the Privacy and Data Protection Practice Group at Littler and author on their blog, Workplace Privacy Counsel. Philip, first off, how did this law come about? It seems like there was a lot of mainstream media publications, pointing to the issue, and then a lot of reactionary measures. But how did this law come about?
Kyle, it's a good question. A little bit surprising how it developed. There was a story in AP that AP published, I think it was in mid-March, and that story seemed to just have gone viral. It really attracted a lot of attention. There were a lot of related stories that came up. There was some YouTube video posted. But what I thought was particularly interesting was that last year in April, about just really almost exactly a year ago, the same issue came up when it was reported that the Maryland Department of Corrections was asking some applicants for their login credentials for Facebook to check whether or not they had any relationships to gangs. And the ACLU caught on that story a year ago, issued a press release. There was some press attention. In fact, there was a bill introduced in the Maryland legislature either last March or April, again around the time of this story. The bill did not make it through the legislation. The story died. So this is really the rebirth of an old story in a way. And it just took off. It really did turn viral.
Yeah, we'd seen a lot of coverage on the whole Facebook password story on LXBN. So many law blogs had written about it after that AP story had come out. And then, of course, we had Maryland actually taking some action on it. But when we look at the action that Maryland took, does this particular legislation have any teeth to it? It's my understanding that it lacks something in enforcement authority.
Colin, you're right. The statute itself does not have an enforcement provision in it. And what that means is that someone technically can't go to court and say, the employer violated this law and I want relief under this law. What we think an employee could do is potentially pursue a claim for wrongful discharge in violation of public policy. The argument that the employee would make is that the law establishes the public policy of Maryland and that the employer's firing an employee for refusing to turn over credentials in response to a request that doesn't fall within any of the exceptions in the law was illegal, an illegal firing. It violated public policy. We won't know until there's actually a lawsuit whether or not that's a viable theory. What also is interesting, though, is typically wrongful discharge claims are brought by current employees. They are discharge claims. And it raises the question whether or not an applicant would be able to bring a claim. There's also a question about whether or not a government agency could enforce this law because there's no express enforcement provision. There probably is a way based on some other law for a government agency to enforce, but again, it's not expressed in the statute.
Yeah, that's what's very interesting. This was a piece of legislation that had seen a lot of coverage, but one note that had been left out is that it didn't necessarily have that enforcement authority behind it, that enforcement action. So it's going to be interesting to watch going forward. And finally, do you expect to see more legislation on this, or is it going to continue to be really up to employers, not lawmakers, to prevent asking employees for Facebook passwords?
Well, personally, I think it should be left up to employers, but I do think that a number of states will enact legislation. Right now, there are bills pending in California, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Washington. There was a report this week that the California legislation breezed through another committee. It's a popular type of legislation similar to legislation restricting employers' ability to use credit information in employment decisions. There are now 7 states with those kinds of laws, and more than a dozen that are considering bills restricting use of credit checks. And it's kind of populist legislation. What I am hoping is that if there is going to be legislation, that it's, I think, better thought out than the Maryland law, that the exceptions are a little bit broader, because there definitely are going to be situations where employers do need access to employees' restricted social media presence. In the Maryland law, there is an exception when the employer suspects that its trade secrets are at risk, or to investigate a securities fraud violation or potential violation. And I don't see any reason to differentiate between securities violations and other legal violations. I think if an employer is presented with suspected unlawful conduct, it really needs the tools to be able to conduct an investigation.
I see. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to watch going forward. This is an issue, again, that generates so much conversation, and with so much of people's lives moving online, it'll be interesting to see how the business community reacts to these types of things. Once again, that was Philip Gordon, chair of the Privacy and Data Protection Practice Group at Littler and author on Workplace Privacy Counsel. For more of their coverage, be sure to visit privacyblog.littler.com. And we have a ton of coverage on LXBN regarding Facebook passwords. When I search for Facebook passwords, click on that tag at lxbn.lexblog.com, and you'll see a ton of commentary. Well, thanks for your time on this, Philip.
You're welcome. Thanks very much, Colin.